France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Romania were all part of the Roman Empire, and each have their respective Romance languages. But what about Africa? For almost a millennium, the provinces of North Africa, with their thriving ceramics and mosaic industries, immense agricultural wealth, and over 600 cities, were an integral part of the Roman Empire. But was there ever a Romance language spoken there? And if so, how comes it just disappeared? Our story begins in the second half of the 1st century BC, when seeking to reduce the Italian peninsula's overpopulation issue, Rome began to send its citizens, many of whom had been legionaries, to North Africa, heavily facilitating the colonization of the region. Okay, but if there really was an African Romance language, how comes Berber has so few Latin loanwords? And since there were hardly any Roman authors from this period, anywhere apart from North Africa, how can we be sure African Romance was a unique language, and not just a form of late Latin? Well, the answer to the first question might lie in the very manner in which the Berber or Tamazight languages work. You see, languages like Numidian, being part of the Afro-Asiatic language family, had a type of non-concatenative morphology, which used triconsonantal roots. This means that many words in modern-day Amazigh languages, derived from Latin, are probably abundant. They've just been modified beyond recognition. An African Romance isn't just some far-fetched theory. There's hard evidence for the language's existence between the 5th and 10th centuries AD. But are we even talking about one language? Well, the short answer is no. Due to the sheer magnitude of the Roman colonies, it's likely the case that there were multiple varieties of Latin spoken in North Africa. The first was the variety spoken in Africa Proconsularis, reported to have been very similar to Sardinian, which isn't surprising, as, according to the historian Theodore Mommsen, nearly a third of the population was made up of Italian colonists, the other 2/3 being Romanized Christian Berbers. The other variety of African Latin was spoken in the colonies of Mauretania Casariensis and Mauretania Tingitana. Due to both proximity and the fact that Mauretania Tingitana was for some time administered together with it, there existed a strong cultural connection between Hispania and these western colonies. I'll explain the differences in just a sec, but for now, let's just group them as one language. I think it's important to mention that just like with classical Latin, there were broad differences between spoken and written forms of the language. There were the texts written in proper Latin, often literary, theological, or epigraphic, and those written in a basilectal form of the language, heavily influenced by the Creole Latin, which was widely spoken at the time. By 711, the majority of people in North Africa spoke a language somewhere along this dialect continuum. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. What was the language actually like? For starters, os and os, words with very different meanings, are said by Saint Augustine in his De Doctrina Christiana to have been easily confused by the Africans. African Latin also diphthongized its open mid-vowels, so deo turned into dieo, and obit into uobit. S was palatalized in the finals of syllables. Lenition occurred, and like Spanish, the language exhibited betacism, where the B and V sounds were often confused. As for the vowels, whilst the western colonies of Mauretania Caesariensis and Tingitana began to evolve a system similar to the asymmetric 6-vowel system of Eastern Romance languages such as Romanian. In Africa Proconsularis, a 5-vowel system, almost identical to Sardinians, was taking hold. In the 8th century, when it came time for the Moors to invade Spain, most North Africans actually knew little to no Arabic, and would have instead used this Berber Latin dialect continuum / Creole. Due to its exportation to Spain with the Umayyads, many of the features of African Latin found their way into Spanish. But in many ways, the arrival of Afro-Romanic speakers was merely a continuation of a connection that had existed between Spain and northwestern Africa for nearly 1,000 years. Okay, I've talked quite a lot about the phonological differences, but someone from Britain and the US might pronounce words differently, and we would still say that they speak the same language. What really set African Romance apart from classical Latin, as well as the other nascent Romance languages, were its archaisms, colloquialisms, syntax and grammar. Due to the difficulty and unreliability of communication, archaisms were more pronounced here than in other Roman provinces. The North Africans also gave their own meanings to certain words. For example, Latin rostrum, which meant beak, in African Latin came to mean face. With the grammar, African Romance adopted the same habeo plus participle construction for the future, as many of the other Romance languages did, and having collapsed to a point where it was no longer usable, Latin's case system was stripped down to the nominative as a general case in the singular, and the accusative as a general case in the plural. African Latin basically made pronouns redundant. It preferred pairs of synonyms to singular terms, and had what was described by outsiders as an addiction to superlatives. Initially, the Umayyads did use African Latin for administration, but they soon switched to using Arabic. After this, the use of Latin was very restricted. That being said, it remained the written language until the 11th century, and has been reported to have been spoken in areas such as the Orez Mountains in eastern Algeria, up to the 15th century. African Romance has also had a mild impact on Berber or Amazigh through the following loanwords. Anyway, that's all for this week. If you've enjoyed this video, consider liking, subscribing, and don't forget to tune in for next week's episode.